What I wanted to present with Mr. Brandt tonight are some findings, lessons learned, and some information from this year's Climate and Culture Survey. And we had a very comprehensive climate and culture survey project this year that is giving us a lot to chew on and a lot of directionals for our next steps going into next school year. So we're going to talk about some of that today and go through some different findings and some different opportunities for next steps in this analysis as well. So the first thing to note is that we have, on any given day, about 2,600 students. So this survey went out to all of them. We ended up with 1,458 responses, about 56%, which is an excellent return on a survey like this. I'm going to ask Mr. Brandt to come up and chat a bit about some of the other implementation maneuvers we went through and some of the other numbers that we got back.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, so one thing to point out too is that this survey, creating the survey and putting together was a key step also in this process. We had surveys that we had run from 2 previous school years that were successful in giving us information. And they were surveys that were Rutgers Department of Ed collaborated to produce a survey that's available for all schools. And it's written in a K-12 setting atmosphere as well. So coming out of those surveys, we felt, you know what, between the fact that it was written for K-12 and also some of the work that we've been focusing on, specifically anti-bias efforts, we felt that we needed a survey that had a little bit more connection with with the information we need from our students. So throughout the winter months, we elicited feedback from students, from staff members, and from parents in what items in that previous survey we can remove, what blanks, what voids were in the survey that we can fill, and what type of questions actually do you wish you were asked that we're not asking here. And then we put together then a survey for both students, which we had over 1,400 students reply. We also had, and one element is we added interviews as well. So part of the survey was if students were interested in being interviewed so that we can dive a little deeper in some of the prompts. 75 students said that yes, they'd be interested in being interviewed, and we interviewed 65 of them. It was great. Also, we had a survey for staff. Approximately 250 of our staff members completed the survey, and we also had a survey for family members, parents, and they were all pushed out during that same early April time period. We had only about 220 parents reply and fill it out. So one of the things that we also, aside from what Dr. Moore is going to lead through here about the student survey, we want to figure out what's a better way to get more parents involved in giving us feedback that we need. Going back to the students, again, over 1,400 responses. It was fantastic that we got that. But it also, in the work of putting it together and not getting the survey out to the students until April, it didn't give us a lot of time to compile the results of all the surveys. So we felt as a committee, let's finish the school year out strong and focus on the student survey first so that we could share back those results with the students before, especially before the seniors graduated, and also to get feedback that would help us through the summer to design, make improvements, tweaks to our practices going into the school year. So that kind of gives you, in a nutshell, the flow of it. We do still have work to do, not only for this, and Dr. Moore is going to talk more about it, but also with the staff and the parent-family survey. That is the next step in getting that information back into the hands of all the constituents, and so we can make changes as we see fit based on that. I'll pass it back to you.
So one of the points in there is, surveys are always imperfect by themselves. They give you directionals. You end up having to kind of use other kinds of methods, interviews, focus groups. That takes more time, and then as you begin to implement some things, taking all of that information as directionals, you're continuing those conversations to see how you're doing. So the information we have to share tonight is of a directional kind of pointers for us. But there are some things that rise out of this survey as real clear themes and real important lessons learned as we move into the 22-23 school year. So, Mr. Brandt mentioned, we had given 2 prior surveys based on the the New Jersey Department of Education climate survey that was developed with Rutgers. And even though these surveys were different from the one that we gave just this past spring, there are enough key questions that are similar that we were able to track some trends. And there are about 19 or 20 questions that are nearly identical out of the whole survey, and we could track trends on those. Everything else represented additional questions for deeper information that we were adding in this year with Mr. Brandt's committee and all of the feedback he was receiving from students and parents driving that effort. So some challenges have emerged as we look at those questions across multiple years. So that handful of questions, those 20 or so questions that we can trace through all 3 surveys, and that's the 18-19, 19-20, and then 21-22 school years. So we did not administer a climate culture survey in 2021. So the first, majority of our students indicate on a common question across these 3 surveys that their peers stand up to help them. That's one of the prompts. Do your peers stand up to help you when necessary? But that total percentage has fallen from the first administration of the survey. So when we first administered this survey, when we were posting for our 4 years of kids about something in the 80s, we were getting positive response on that. That's fallen a bit since the initial administrations of the survey. That points to work that we have to do, and all of these things point to work that we have to do that I'll start covering as we continue through. Majority of students report that their families encourage them to do well in school, but that, interestingly, has fallen somewhat significantly from prior surveys. So where we were seeing upwards of almost 100% of students reporting that, we saw a drop there. We also saw a majority feeling that they can express themselves, but that's also fallen a bit over the past couple of years, so since the initial survey. So we're seeing clear indications of work that we need to do with our students and our families to reconnect, and as we come out of the strange few years that we've been through, a need to focus more on how we can move day to day through some of the challenges that are being shown here. Majority of our students feel safe at school, but that's fallen just a tiny bit. I'm going to talk about that in more detail later on. I bring that up here because I want to point at some particular areas where that's shifted a bit. But vast majority of students are feeling safe at school. Majority report that the school addresses mental health. That's also fallen a bit, and that speaks certainly to the work that we've had to do to understand different kinds of mental health support that our students need at this time, certainly coming out of the pandemic. And I want to continue to speak optimistically about coming out of the pandemic. We also saw positive changes in the survey over those three years. So it wasn't all about declines. We also have positive changes. So our students have been asked questions about cheating on assignments over the course of these 3 surveys, and that's increased considerably over the life of these surveys. So we've gone up to 84% of students reacting unfavorably to cheating, and that's a testament certainly to the work that our teachers are doing in creative assigning, creative assessment. Majority report that their teachers encourage them. That's also increased significantly over the life of the 3 surveys that we've given. And we have a majority of students reporting that they overall, looking back over the course of the school year, they enjoy school, and that's an increase from prior surveys as well. Now, those lessons that I talked about, those analyses of changes over time, come from looking at the survey and looking how answers clump. And so some example of how that works, if we are able to turn survey responses into a scaled score. So let's say your survey response, depending on how positive or negative it is, gets a score of 0 to 4. And then we start to look at, all right, well, where's our target response area? We want to see on this particular question responses at a 2 or higher. That becomes our target response area. We want to see more and more responses at 2 or higher. You can see survey responses might clump in certain ways. And so when we look at it this way, that's where we get something like, oh, a majority of students, 57%, 84%, whatever percent of students answered in a positive way as opposed to in a negative way, or vice versa. X percentage of students answered in a challenging way to us. So that's how we look at how survey responses clump to get the information that I just shared. But there's another whole way to look at this. And that's where we do averages. Averages are of little value by themselves when you're looking at the whole survey. What was the average score of each question is hard to really understand or get a lot of information from, because you could have vastly different scenarios that provide the same average. So, clumping like this would provide the exact same average score as clumping like that, but they tell two very different stories, right? So students answering in this way are split on the extreme ends of a question, and that's an important thing for us to know. Students here are clumped in the middle, and that's an important thing for us to know, and so therefore those are two very different scenarios. We can use averages. They're more valuable, not perfect, but they're more valuable when we start disaggregating the data into different groups. So when we start comparing the responses of different groups. And different averages there can signal potential different leanings in the results. And that's where we get to now looking at some of the issues that Mr. Brandt was talking about that we wanted to capture in this survey. Differences based on identity and background and all different sorts of demographics to understand where might there be differences in how people are experiencing the school here. So different average signals pointing to different leaning. I can give an example for a question, say, where, I don't know, males answer in this distribution, but females might answer in this distribution. That's just an example pulled out of the air here. Those are two very different stories. So this answer leans in one direction, this answer leans toward a more positive direction, and therefore we need to know that different kinds of people are having different experiences and answering on average in different ways. But again, it's not perfect, it's still just directional information. Focus groups and all that additional work that Mr. Brandt talked about help us get deeper into understanding here. So let's talk about that a little bit. Using that kind of analysis now, comparing averages, comparing average scores, we can start to look at different experiences of belonging here at Central based on a lot of the other questions that are in the survey. So the survey asks students to identify their grade. That's one dimension that we can look at. Ask them to identify their race and ethnicity, and ask them whether or not they're a member of the school's LGBTQ+ community. Those were three dimensions that that the committees and folks wanted to focus on in the analysis of these survey results. So this was an anonymous survey, totally anonymous, but we captured these demographic data on each student respondent. So the grades that were reported pretty evenly across all four grades. So 9th through 12th grade, we were fairly even across all four grades, adding up to 1458 responses. The races and ethnicities reported, now this adds up to something higher than 1458. Again, students could pick multiple ethnicities, but some students also preferred not to answer this question at all. But you can see where different races and ethnicities were identified here and the numbers of students in each. The point to make on this is when you analyze these results, we had about 439 of survey respondents were Black, Indigenous, or people of color, so BIPOC students. And what that indicates, 30%, that's higher than what we've talked about in our other demographic analyses. In our other demographic analyses, we've been using terms like 1 in 4. We've been talking about 25%. So this survey is showing the respondents, at least, are reaching toward more 30% of people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. So you have all of this now broken down in the survey results. LGBTQ+ identification, we had 223 students identify as yes, 1135 identifying as no, and 100 declining to answer. We removed those 100 out of the analysis for that group because we couldn't determine certainly where they might identify. But when you look at 223 out of our population of survey respondents, that's about 15%, and that mirrors what we've seen in other surveys as well. So 15% is a number that's come up in several measurements here for the size of our LGBTQ plus student population. So when we analyze results, now we can break down the results by all those dimensions. And this is how that started to look to us. When we analyzed the results by grade level, we generally saw similar responses across each grade level. There weren't a lot of differences. So what freshmen said, sophomores said, juniors, seniors said, it was all very similar. There might have been some differences, but for the most part, it was all very similar. However, the way that they answered across multiple questions presented some interesting opportunities for us to dig in. So we found, for example, 9th and 12th graders were more consistently positive, way more consistently positive. When you do color mapping, when you do heat maps on them, it's bright green and bright green for 9th and 10th or 9th and 12th graders. Way more positive responses than 10th and 11th graders in general. That's something we have to dig into and understand, well, why is that? It's not a finding or a conclusion that we could say is any more than a guess right now, but it's not lost on us, certainly, that our 9th and our 12th graders were the only class cohorts that had full in-person introductions to the school over the past several years. That's not lost on us as a factor in this, but I can't share that as a conclusion. I share that just as a right now. 10th graders in general gave the least positive responses on this survey, which, again, when you look at the heat mapping, there's a lot of red in their column as the lowest numbers in their groups, even though the numbers across the rows weren't significantly different. We also noted 10th graders feeling unsafe in two particular areas. Two particular areas came up, and they came up primarily for 10th graders: hallways, lavatories. We'll talk about that in a little bit, too, as it informs our next steps. More often than other students in other grades. Now, remember what I said earlier, the vast majority of students in the survey said that they felt comfortable in all areas, felt safe in all areas, but these two areas popped a little bit for our 10th graders. It's also curious because our 9th and 10th graders share the same facilities. They're in the 9-10 building, yet the 10th graders had a different response than the 9th graders did. So that's something that we have to understand. Finally, 10th graders reported feeling more likely to experiencing bullying than students in other grades. 9th graders actually reported the lowest likelihood of being bullied, which it was an interesting finding for us as well, because we don't typically expect to see that in our youngest grades. We expect our youngest grades to be working through some of those things a little bit more, but they reported the lowest likelihood. So as that played out across grades, that's what that looked like. Now, when we look at race and ethnicity and LGBTQ plus identification, we see other clear areas, next levels of work for us here at Hunterdon Central. On average, our BIPOC, our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our BIPOC students are less likely to report being involved in clubs and activities. And you can see where, again, we're taking averages, and averages are tough to look at except when we're looking at differences. But when you see the difference there, our students of color and Black, Indigenous students, 1.71 average score on questions about extracurricular activities, while our white students scored 2.1% average. So our BIPOC students were less likely to report being involved in clubs and activities. We don't have, by the way, and traditionally we don't have great census taking around our clubs and activities. That has to change. We've talked about that quite a bit, that we have to have a better handle on the membership of those clubs and activities so that we can continue to track that. Less likely to report, yeah. No, well, yes, actually, yes. Yes, it does. In the framing of the question, yes, it does. We have a better accounting of sport rosters, yeah. On average, students feeling that staff and students treat people fairly. This was also different. Our BIPOC students averaging 2.39 on being treated fairly by staff, while white students were 2.75, and then lower for students in general. And that's something to point out there, is that the highest score, 2.21, for how fairly students treat each other was lower than the lowest score for staff. So students are recognizing, I think, one thing we might be able to say from this, again, we need to dig deeper, students are recognizing the work that staff members are doing to address this specifically in classes and other places, but they're finding it less expansive through their peers as it is through staff members. On average, less likely to report connecting with an adult or belonging at Central. And you can see those differences there, averages of 1.38 versus 1.59, and averages of 1.55 versus 2.22. These are the most significant differences. There are other differences in some of the questions, but I picked the ones here for you that had the largest amount of difference, that were closest to being potentially significant. Now, our LGBTQ plus students basically reported the same kinds of trends, but they had some additional information for us about their experience that was different from Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we had, on average, students in the LGBTQ plus community, again, that's 15% based on this survey, less likely to report feeling like they matter to others. And that's an expansive question. It wasn't feeling matter to others necessarily in school, right? It was to matter to others, period. So this is an interesting and troubling finding, or a troubling piece of data, that there's a difference of, fairly wide difference between those two answers. Less likely, LGBTQ plus students, less likely to report enjoying school. Less likely to report that students help one another, and that's a very large difference in average score there. 1.96 versus 2.23 is pretty large. Less likely to report that they're comfortable expressing themselves. And again, you can see where this fits into some of the larger results that we talked about earlier, where scores like students feeling able to express themselves moving down a little bit over the course of the surveys. And now we find these differences among groups. It helps us target our responses to close those gaps. And then less likely, or more likely to report, in this case, more likely to report likelihood of experiencing bullying. And the board has seen that in HIB cases this year, where they involved accusations of bias. And you can see that they averaged lower toward the desired response of not experiencing bullying, less so than their non-LGBTQ plus peers. And that's a fairly large difference as well there. So we have next steps to think about in response to all of these initial findings. I want to piggyback a little bit on what Mr. Brandt said. There's more understanding to gain. This is the first of several conversations that we're going to have both in Student Life and Program and in other committees, and also here about the results of not just this survey, but also continued work on the parent survey, which had a very small turnout. We need to bulk that up with some additional investigation, and the staff survey as well. So all of those have to fit in here as well to give us the full story. Right now we have some directionals. And based on other data that we've talked about, we've talked a lot about discipline data this year and different discipline concerns from this past school year. We have some clear next steps as we head into next school year, even though we're continuing the investigation. So we know, based on the data that we've seen, that staff training on relationship building has to continue, because we saw some, we're not satisfied with the level at which students are reporting that they have a close connection with an adult here. We need to see that come up, and we need to see that come up in a culturally competent way. So anti-bias education needs to continue as well. Our students who identify in different gender and sexual identities, our students who belong to different racial ethnic communities, different religious communities, need to feel that connection as well. We also note the very big differences between how students talk about fair treatment from staff and fair treatment from their peers. And that points us towards the need to continue to extend conversations about relationship building and bias to students. Much more explicit and direct instruction about that. We've started some of that this year. You've heard about that through some of the departmental supervisory conversations that we've had, but we see a continued need to be extra explicit about that. Mr. Brandt and his team and folks have talked about leveraging activity blocks a lot more deliberately for that, and in that too, expanding mentorship opportunities between kids. Sources of Strength, which is an organization Mr. Brandt has spearheaded over the past couple of years, is now at a size and strength and has capacity to be able to move forward on a lot of those campaigns, along with a lot of other student organizations that have been focusing on providing kids safe spaces to give us feedback and also to relate to one another. So we've got to leverage all of that much more deliberately next year. Sharing and cooperation with parents and the larger community. There's a lot of talk right now as we move into the school year about shared decision-making and broader communication. And a lot of times that conversation is about administration and staff engaging in shared decision-making and broader communication, but that extends out to all of our other stakeholders as well, students, parents, other community members, members of different community organizations that are trying to do important work in our community, all different kinds of folks across our school landscape. And here, again, Mr. Brandt has spent a lot of work this past year, has done a lot of work this past year on connecting with parents to design not a PTA, not a PTO, but something different to exist in this landscape of governance and policy and improvement. And so we're looking forward to that coming out to everybody in the fall as well. Students, and again, including just students in discussions on governance and policymaking. One of the things on the agenda tonight is first read for the state-mandated policy around student members of the Board of Education. But a lot of districts will do that by having a student sit at the Board of Education table and deliver a report like we've done here. Students come to this podium, deliver a report, and they let us know what's going on. We imagine and envision something that's a lot more robust in terms of our student organizations, whether it's student council augmented by other organizations of students, or whether it's a change in the way student council operates. We envision that students can be brought into governance and policymaking discussions a lot more often and a lot more deliberately to have more ownership. One of the questions in the survey, which didn't come up as a significant change over the years, was, do you feel like you can help make decisions in the school? And we've never been satisfied with the level that our students report there. So this is a good time to move forward. Including students in discussions on governance and policymaking is including our chief clients in having a voice at the table for all of the things that are being done around and for them. Increased campus security. Now, this is in response to all sorts of things, but particularly thinking about where students have reported feeling unsafe on campus. In particular, I pointed out 10th graders talking about the bathrooms, talking about the hallways. On the agenda tonight is a motion to ask for your approval to secure a third Class 3 officer from Raritan Township. They're ready to vote on that as well, which means that with your approval and the town council's approval, we can move forward on bringing in a third Class 3 officer. We're ready for that expense. We've seen it. The police have talked to us. Our partners in law enforcement have talked to us about the need to have some additional help on campus, not just because of things that happen on campus, but because across our community, they've had many, many, many more interactions with youth over the prior 2 years than they've had in years before that. And I'm not just talking about in school, I'm talking about out of school as well. So there's a ripe opportunity there for greater partnership with them, and they're some of our best partners at Raritan Township PD. And lastly, in our conversation tonight, there are some things that we need to really firm up on in terms of cell phone use and I know we've talked about where social media has played a role in a lot of the problems that we've had between students, in students' awareness of and use of social media, dangers, responsibilities, and everything that comes with it. We need here to think differently about how cell phones are used in school. Right now, our policy allows us to take stricter approaches to that. And I don't mind using that word, and I don't use it lightly or accidentally. Stricter approaches is something that we need to do here. Not just because social media is in the background of a lot of the interactions that are troubling between students that we've seen, but also because social media has been a significant distraction to our students. One thing I can tell you, for example, is in our policy, during class time, it is forbidden for students to use cell phones without the permission of their teacher. But one of the things that can happen is a student can leave the room to go to the lavatory, and if they have their cell phone with them, they're using their cell phone during class time. It's time to start reading that policy and enacting that policy to the letter. During class time, from bell to bell, cell phones will not be permitted out in the open, no matter where a student is. Lunchtime, passing time, these are times when a teacher might say to students, I need you to use your phones for X, Y, or Z if they're doing a Quizlet or something on the phone, or if there's often students are recording, doing different recordings for assignments. Those are times when teachers are directing and allowing cell phones to be out. But we need to, and we can do that right away because that's in our policy, but we also need to begin to talk with students and parents about a better policy. It's time to update that policy and face facts about what the reliance upon these devices is creating for our children. One of the things that I think about here, we do our monthly Student of the Month luncheons, and we use that as an opportunity to poll them and talk to them. It's a diverse group of kids. They've been recognized for all kinds of goodness, not just good course grades. They've been helpful. And I've been popping in and out of classrooms with questions like this too. I ask our students in all of these contexts, how many of you want to use your phones less than you do? And I ask them to close their eyes so they can't see each other raising their hands. How many of you want to use your phones less than you do? And 70 to 80% of our students raise their hands. They want it. And in their most honest moments, they're telling us that. I see it with my own children. I see it with me. I see it with all of us. It's time for us, as we come out of the pandemic and celebrate in-person, face-to-face engagement, that we put our rules and our structures behind that as well, and be very deliberate. And though it may feel strict as it begins, we have to be very deliberate about expecting that among our students. And we feel that that will go a long way toward the relationship building that we're trying to be explicit about elsewhere. So we will see that as we come into the school year as well, in our communications coming into the 22-23 school year, that our stance on phones is going to shift to meet the challenges that we've seen. So much more to come. I opened by talking about how there's directionals here. Did I miss anything in that sort of next steps? Thanks. Talked about directionals, talking about needing to dig deeper, talking about needing to talk to more folks. We have more sets of data to bring into this, but from what we've been able to analyze so far, those are the steps that we see ourselves able to take as soon as next school year.